My dear listeners, my friend and colleague is back. My favorite speaker and the man that believes that each and every person, including himself, is doing the best that they can with the tools that they have in that moment. Welcome to the show, Dr. Chris Pachel.
Oh my goodness, Marissa. Like that is like the best intro ever. And it just makes my heart swell like two additional
I thought
sides
you'd like that.
I do. I love that. I love it. Thank you for having me on. Of course. Thank you.
Always a pleasure. So in today's episode, Dr. Pachel and I are going to be exploring the process and benefits of teaching relaxation to our canine clients. And I often hear you, Chris, talking about your cases a lot of the time and using this as such a go-to tool. And I wanted to just really dive into what you have seen in terms of the benefits and why this is such, why this is such an important tool in your toolbox. So let's first identify to the listeners what this relaxation protocol is and why it's so important.
Yeah, so I can kind of come at this from a timeline, if you will, even just to kind of walk people through kind of how I landed where I am right now with the usage of this particular technique, not only sort of where it started from, but where it's kind of evolved. Perfect. So when I was starting out as a resident and, sort of learning about behavior, one of the presenters, one of the gurus, one of the diplomats, the board certified veterinary behaviorists that was everywhere and is still everywhere, it was Dr. Karen Overall. Mm-hmm. And so she has, as most of the listeners or many of them probably know, she has her protocol for relaxation. And, and I initially was taught that as part of my residency as one of the tools that we could use in all of the contexts in which Dr. Overall was utilizing it. And I sort of had a love-hate relationship with it, truth be told. I was like, cool, I think I can see some practical advantage of this, but quite honestly, this handout is so flippin' long.
Yes.
Who in their right mind is going to go through all of this? And I found it a little academic in the way that it was presented. And so I was like, I think I get why this could be helpful here, but I'm not loving it. I'm not leaning into it. And I certainly wasn't selling it for my clients. So, what I found though, sort of as I started to play with it in individual cases where my mentor and I said, hey, well, why don't we try this? Let's see what happens. Is that what I found is that when it clicked, when it worked, when the client was doing it, when the dog responded well to it, or the cat for that matter, because we use it with cats too, believe it or not.
Oh, fun.
That's a whole other conversation. But when we got the results we were looking for, what I found was that I was getting, almost the equivalent of like a meditative process where I would get animals that it's almost like we were helping facilitate that sort of taking of the breath and softening the posture. And to some degree, even before we really dealt with whatever their specific issue was, it was as if we were helping to walk down the emotional arousal that was impeding their learning or preventing them from accessing the skills or the techniques or whatever else it was that we were working on. So it became almost universal within sort of this population, that whenever we found that we were dealing with significant anxiety issues, or we wanted to create moments of stillness, not like you must stay where I put you, but moments of stillness from can we pause and just take in our surroundings without reacting to every little stimulus or without looking over our shoulder, worrying about what's going to happen next. It started to work its way in more and more. And what I found in doing that, modifying the protocol as it was originally written, is that I found that rather than working in a sit or even in the traditional sort of Sphinx down, really morphing it into that relaxed down with the hips in a lateral position, elbows sort of up in the Sphinx position. I don't worry so much about a head down posture for most of my dogs. I find that just getting the hips shifted over and getting that sort of sternum or sternal contact with the floor is sufficient. But in doing that, we were getting that sort of release of body tension that then allowed us to move forward. And so So the morphing of it was both in the posture. I was originally taught the relaxation exercise in a seated position. I didn't love it. I never connected with that. For me, it's always in the relaxed down position. I phased out the vast majority of the instructions and boiled it down to about just a page. And basically, here's what we're doing. Here's why. Here's the lure. This is what we're doing. And creating just a much more functional education piece versus all of the backstory about why and what's happening in the physiology and all of the other stuff. It's of course important for practitioners to know, but most of my clients didn't need that information. So that's some of sort of the evolution of sort of why it came into practice and sort of what we did to really modify the actual exercise itself. And we can dive into much more of the nuts and bolts on that. But yeah, that's kind of where it kind of came from for me.
Yeah. And so the hesitation of the overall, or the resistance towards that protocol, was really the position of the dog, it sounds like.
It was twofold. Right? It was the position, and it was also the sort of the length of the instructions that, I mean, truthfully, if you go back to the original protocol, and this is not in any way a negative, the information was fantastic. It was really helpful for me in understanding how to coach my clients. But I found that for most of my clients, they either just skipped the entire... They
skipped to day one.
Yeah, and then 100%. They were doing it wrong because they didn't actually have the understanding of what we were trying to accomplish, or they didn't actually do any of it because they're like, they got that printed out handout. Again, this was back in the days where everything was printed. We weren't just sharing PDFs via email. So I had my manila folder with all of my printed out handouts going out to my house calls.
Yeah.
Right. And I could give them the stack of paper. So, I just found it wasn't useful. At least in my hands. And that's an important thing, whether we're talking relaxation exercises or whether we're talking about other techniques. If someone else is finding success with a technique, but you're not, I'm always curious about that, right? Is it something in the verbiage and the way that we're sharing it? Is it something about how we actually resonate with that particular technique? What's going on there? It may not be about the technique itself.
Yes. So 2 weeks ago, I got to see you in person, and which was so amazing. And I was talking to a colleague, wonderful trainer in the Golden, Colorado area. And we were talking about a specific technique. And I was like, gosh, I've never really resonated with that particular technique. Here's why. Here's what I think is contributing. And she was like, oh, I always use it in this particular context. And then she was the one that was really intuitive in the sense that, like, well, Marissa, your relationship to that technique is the relationship that you're going to bring when you're talking about it with clients. So if your clients aren't necessarily following through with that particular technique, I wonder how you're presenting it. Like, do you present it with some hidden, like, not really soul, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, 100%. Like, I thought it was such an amazing, like, shout out to Jen Tixay, to really bring that forward. Cause I was like, yes, I don't necessarily need that particular technique. Like, it's okay. But it was a really interesting moment where you're right. Like, it might not be the technique. It might not be the protocol. It might be our relationship to it.
Yes.
So something to look at, which I thought was really fascinating.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I find that, again, much further beyond just the individual technique, but whether it's something about what we're doing in our individual practices or businesses, there's so many layers to that if there is a little bit of a hesitation or a little bit of a glitch, everything else feels smooth. And then there's that awkward pause. Totally. Clients pick up on it. They're like, wait a minute, something just shifted. I don't know what, but
does she not feel comfortable? Does he not feel comfortable with that? Yes. Like,
moment of skepticism.
Exactly.
And then lo and behold, they don't lean in, right? They don't actually do the work there. And we go, gosh, I don't know why.
Oh, I need more client compliance. It's like, no, actually there's other stuff at play here. Yeah.
Totally.
So, okay. So you alluded to this a little bit in terms of, like, some of the cases that you suggest this for. I mean, yes. I don't think anyone can go wrong, right? Whether it's like you have an adolescent puppy or whether you have an adult dog, whether you have a dog that's fearful, anxious, like you can't really go wrong with, like, this should be one of the behaviors taught, right?
Yes.
So But what sort of cases do you really lean on it heavily for?
Yeah, it really is. Again, I almost use that word universal again. It is something that is a really strong tool for me across a wide variety of circumstances. And I guess it's less about sort of when do I lean into this technique and more about how do I modify the technique to fit the needs of the case that I'm working on.
Mm-hmm.
Meaning, in some of my cases, if I've got a dog that really tends to struggle with the recovery phase, so there's some arousal stimulus, and they really struggle to kind of regain control or to take that breath, then I'm actually probably for that dog going to spend a whole lot less time working on duration of relaxation and more time on practicing what would it look like to be just a little bit animated. Call over, sit down, settle, breathe. Short
Mm-hmm.
duration just to settle in. All done. Let's go do something fun and then practice again. So my repetitions for that particular animal are more about teaching this skill set
To like
of
come
pausing,
up and come
breathing.
down.
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Versus another dog for a lot of my, let's say, my noise phobia patients, where their natural response is to startle or react or perhaps avoid or flee from a situation. And we have this sense that, gosh, if you could just sit in it for a moment and process what's happening around you, I think we could potentially make some headway on that emotional reaction. So for those
Mm-hmm.
animals, we may teach the relaxation exercise in more of a traditional sense, with or without a mat, but in a comfortable position in that relax down with duration, adding in those little movements, adding in some little distractions.
Yeah.
We're creating a structure and basically a framework
Yeah.
that then allows us to layer in knocks and whistles and bells and thunder and all of those things. So in that case, I'm going to modify it and really lean on sort of the duration with distractions.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really where I'm going to put the majority of my emphasis. Do I need to practice that same sort of come up, come down? No, that's not an aspect of the exercise that's likely to be particularly meaningful for that dog's individual needs.
Yeah.
So I think that's a better, and I'm actually realizing as I was saying that out loud today, I've never really thought about it in quite that way, that it's not like I have this one technique.
Yeah. You're like session 2, relaxation protocol. Here we go. Yeah. It's not like that.
No, it's not like that. And in other cases, it's, we're utilizing relaxation to address arousal around food.
Mm-hmm.
In other cases, the arousal around food is the obstacle to working forward. Like there's all of these individual things about what we're trying to accomplish based on the need of that learner. Again, do they need to pause and take a breath? Do they need to be able to settle? Do they have a lot of active responses? And that's creating problems for other reasons within the household. And so we want to be able to teach or strengthen, start to build more of a sedentary response that, that again, that sort of expands that particular skill set. And that's even before we get into the different ways of teaching it, whether that's lure reward, whether that's capturing, whether it's shaping. Do we mark yes or no? Are we on a mat? Maybe, maybe not. All of the individual variations. And I'll be very honest, I get a little bit worried when I start saying, oh my gosh, there's 432 different ways that we can modify the exercise. Because when we do that, it's really easy to get lost in it versus feeling like, hey, there is this one exercise, just start by teaching this. And so I do find that, yes, there is sort of a standard way of teaching it that I do for most of my learners. And then we can modify as we see what really works for that particular dog or that particular owner or caregiver or trainer. And then we can figure out where we go from there.
Yeah. I wonder if that's why this is, you and I were talking before we press record, like that. I wonder why this has always felt like one more thing, right? It has felt like I have some clients where they have the bandwidth for a variety of things. And then I have some clients that don't, and that's totally okay. And sometimes what I will do is I will at least get their foot in the door with, okay, if you're going to be relaxing, watching Netflix, I want you to throw the mat out, ask the dog to come lie down, and give them a frozen topple right on the mat, so that we could at least get some positive association and some relaxation type tendencies by licking and lying down on the mat. And it's what I would call like passive training. Like we're not actively training anything, and like they're not really engaged with the dog, which even if I'm assigning active training, I also really encourage them to do some passive training too. So it really is about like, I don't have to be engaged with you. This is not like we're in training mode. This is just, we're both here together and you're doing this really calming thing in this particular location. And so, but going back to some of my resistance, just some of my relationship with it, I'm like, oh, wow. And sometimes it feels like one more thing. And how I hear you, how you're describing it, it feels way more integrated, and it feels like it's part of the training plan, just not like one other thing that we can do that everyone said is a good thing. Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes,
and then it becomes one more thing.
Yeah. No, and I remember as I was sharing it, like as you said right before we started the record today, having some of the early conversations where I was starting to really feel how valuable this could be and seeing the benefits. And I would write my plans. And especially if it was a trainer that was working in my community that I was collaborating with, but that wasn't employed by me or a part of my team, I would put it down here, and they were interpreting in very much the same way. It was like, cool, we worked on cue, response, reward sequences, and we're working on our desensitization. And we didn't quite get to the relaxation work yet, but we will.
Totally.
No, you won't.
And that's the trainer's relationship to it, right? Like
totally.
The client, I'm sure the client wasn't like, ooh, no, thank you. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, it just never, ever happened. And so I had a very similar conversation to say, hey, what about this isn't working? And they had many of the same objections that I did when I started. Like, I don't love the position. I'd rather do it this way. Or it just feels so arduous and extra. And it's like, cool. So let's chunk it. Like, so you're thinking about those day one tasks and there's 18 different things. Do 3. Like if you've got that little moment, ask your dog to lie down for 5 seconds, for 10 seconds, 1 step back, 2 steps back, call it for the day, move on.
Yeah.
But you've created that little moment within which to be able to facilitate that relaxation. And for so many of our dogs, I find, who are sort of so, busy, either because of stress or anxiety or insufficient mental stimulation or enrichment, it creates a bit of connection, or it can create some connection. Ideally, it's not adding additional pressure or expectancy of must do this and it must be perfect. It's really, can you settle for me? Let's see, where are we at today? And so we really tried to remain very flexible around that. And even thinking about what was originally day one was sort of the first set of tasks. When your dog is able to achieve those and remain relaxed and soft and loose, cool. Then go on to the next set of tasks, but don't tie yourself into feeling like that needs to happen on day 2.
Yeah, totally.
And so we made an intentional word change. I actually forgot about that. We made an intentional word change where it was sort of the next set of tasks and then the next set of tasks. And we were able to increase the difficulty as the dog was ready. But if they needed 3 weeks on day 1, cool. I really don't care. That's what we do with desensitization, right?
Yeah.
It's not about arbitrarily moving forward one day. It's practice that proficiency, create that level of fluency, and when you're capable, level up.
Yeah.
So we changed the dialogue around that as well and got rid of a lot of that sort of, you must dedicate 20 minutes 3 times a day or whatever that sort of mindset was for the owners. And it truly could be a minute here, a minute there, as long as the animal was coming along for the ride within that training session.
Yeah, I just, for our listeners that are not familiar with the Care and Overall protocol and what Chris is referring to, which is there is day 1, and then there's a list of tasks, like you said, right? Like take 2 steps to the right, come back, mark and feed. Take 2 steps to the left, come back, mark and feed. Take 10 steps back, right? Like, and what she's really trying to work on is adding distance, duration, and distraction. And I love that you reframed the days, because I always am hesitant in giving them to my clients, because I'm like, okay, so remember, you can always break the day down. Like that could be like 6 training sessions, right? And so I love that you reframed the language around it. I also, what I do love about Karen's protocol, or Dr. Overall's protocol, is really this idea of my clients don't have to think about it, right?
Yes.
They're like, oh, okay, now I'm like, they don't even know that they're really working on distance, distraction, and duration, but they're doing it in this really like systematic step way. And then I always say, if that particular step was too hard, then I want you to make it easier or assess the situation, whether or not we need to call it quits in terms of the training session. But I love that. But have never been able to really articulate that the days, like naming each day, has been tricky, because I feel like my clients want to push, and they're like, oh, we're failing because we're on day 4, but we're still on day 2's training protocol.
Yes.
So
that was the feedback I was getting. It was exactly that. It was like, well, we've been doing it for 7 days, but we're only on day 3.
Yeah.
Like, you've been doing it for 7 days.
Yeah. Like that's huge.
Amazing. Like, yes, run with that. But it was like that setup for disappointment. And so it's like, cool, let's get rid of the language around that. The structure is great for exactly the reason that you mentioned. We're actually coaching owners without directly coaching. We're giving them the opportunity to model what it looks like to do some probe trials, because every once in a while there's a little bit more of a stretch within the difficulty level of that particular task. So they're learning probe trials, they're learning repetition, they're learning how to warm up at the beginning of a session. They're learning how to sort of chunk things versus looking at big lumped task lists. They're learning a lot of those things by practicing them without having to think about it, and without having to be creative or to be intentional about how to manipulate those stimulus gradients. So I love so many things about that original protocol. And with some of the modifications that made it more accessible, we added some cute pictures to it and just little stuff to soften it around the edges that made clients kind of lean into the practice. And it was amazing to me what we started to see, and what I get over and over and over again, whether we're practicing just a minute here or a minute there, or whether we're taking a more intensive look at it, is that we almost always get a spontaneous report from the client of, now that I'm seeing what it looks like for my dog to actually soften into this, they're doing it more often. Which then
cool.
Right, like it's a reinforced behavior, so we see more of it, which creates more reinforcement opportunities, which creates more fluency. And so we get, without having to overwork it or without having to micromanage it, we're getting this sort of organic shift to an animal who is either sort of capable of watching the world go by with some of those distractions and some of those tasks that are happening around them, or they're learning how to take that breath and settle, or perhaps it's an animal where they're learning both, depending on their individual needs. I love all of those things.
So I want to go back to, because I have a few questions about like the part where you were saying, the dog or the animal, right? Because you're talking about cats too, but the dog has a moment, they are aroused by their environment, and you might cue them to do something else or whatnot, or waiting for a different choice, but they're still having a hard time recovering. And then you insert the relaxation there. So it's almost like you've come up, you are trying to come down, but you need a little help. So I'm going to help you out with this relaxation. And I'm curious to know what you think about, like, if I'm thinking about a reactive dog, a dog that has just reacted to their environment, they are aroused, it could be barking and lunging, they could be conflicted by their environment, uncomfortable, and they might, I'm thinking about like, what is the difference between that, your relaxation protocol, and a scatter feed? Because I'm feeling like a scatter feed is like the beginning, and then the relaxation feels like the icing on the cake, right? To like take it a step further. Does that make sense to you?
It makes total sense. Yeah. And what you've outlined there is something that I refer to, my team refers to as walking down arousal. And it's something that just sort of, again, kind of evolved. And so I'll walk you through. I wish that at his sort of peak of reactivity, I had gotten this as a really good sequence on video. I don't have it, but I keep meaning to. For Cornelius, for my own dog, when he's in a heightened arousal state, relaxation is one of the most challenging things for him. But for him, it's one of the things that we've developed such that it has a tremendous therapeutic benefit to it. Now, I could just say, you're really, really worked up right now, but I need you to relax and settle. You know, Cornelius, calm down.
Yeah, I was going to say, because that works for anyone with a nervous system.
Right? So probably not therapeutic, but yet I also know that when he takes a breath, that's what's going to start to facilitate that reset. So the way that I tend to look at this walking down of arousal is to say, at his peak of arousal, what is still accessible for him? So for him, it's typically a find it. So I might even sort of, lean a little bit on pattern games, for example, where it might be sort of a right, left, find it, find it, find it, find it, find it. So I'm sort of almost leaning into the frantic movement where his arousal, so that he's like, boom, 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 boom.
I got to dissipate the charge.
Blow it off, blow it off, blow it off. And as soon as he starts to get a little bit more intentional with looking, then I'm going to slow down the find it, or I might even start placing instead of tossing. And when he's sort of following me more intentionally, cool, you've got sort of lower vibrations in that moment. So now I might pause, wait for you to offer eye contact or a shake off or a ground sniff, or again, whatever's relevant for you. What's your next stage? And for him, he loves doing hand targeting. So I may then offer a hand target and ask him to move in a very intentional pattern. And then there's a little bit of a pause in between. So rather than just being sort of the scatter feed or the pattern game find it, he's now moving back intentionally in different directions. And now I'm getting a sort of a cue response reward predictability that he can opt into, which is creating more of that structure that allows him to kind of start to refocus his brain, essentially trying to re-engage that prefrontal cortex and get that cognitive regulation of emotional arousal to start getting him to reset. And when he starts to really then connect back in with me, then I could say, can you sit? Could you spot? Which is his cue for the settle cue. So, and if he can, awesome, then he settles, takes that breath, and then I might do just one or two easy reps of the basic relaxation work. Wait, one step, two step, and I can just see his entire body melting. And then when I say, all done, he stands up.
Yeah.
What do you need next? Yeah, and so I've got him back, but I didn't fight with it to make him relax, nor did I rest on the scatter feed was enough to redirect his focus. I actually want him to practice recovering. And that's where, for me, that it's a practical application of that out in the real world that, we had to practice first. It wasn't just practicing the relaxed down position in my living room, but we generalized it. We practiced it in the living room and the dining room and the bedroom, and we practiced it on an elevated surface, and we practiced on the back patio. We practiced on the front stoop, and we practiced in the doorway of the RV. And we just did that as life happened, so that skill is available to him when his arousal level is just close enough to it that he can grab on and get that last little bit. And then we might go into, more of a sniff walk. Sort of, again, there's all sorts of ways that we could take it. But for him, it's that extra little bit. And not every dog needs that, right? So there are some dogs where you could do a scatter feed and you just see them decompress in the midst of that, and they're good. Right? In which case, then maybe going to the point of trying to get that icing on the cake, maybe that's not particularly relevant or necessary or helpful. Cool. Then you just made your homework a whole lot easier by not having to do that little bit extra. But for the dogs who really struggle with regulating emotional arousal, I do find that framework of the exercise itself really gives them something to latch onto, whether it's just the mechanical skill, almost thinking more operant, the mechanical skill of knowing what to do. For some, it's addressing the anxiety and the predictability of having a sequence to follow in the framework or the structure that actually allows us to implement greater intensities of noises or stimulus gradients for whatever it is that we're desensitizing to, because they're leaning within the structure and the predictability of that. And then in other cases, it's really just about the emotional quality and the opportunity for them to get more of a CER to whatever's going on because of the food reinforcement or whatever it is that they tap into. So it is incredibly versatile when we think about it with that level of versatility and flexibility.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm thinking about like two of my clients right now and how this could be like the scatter feed does help. And yet, are we like, do we come down enough? Are we remaining too high? Especially in certain locations of the walk, and especially, especially in certain circumstances, like how can we incorporate that into, it's so funny because I've always had this thought like, well, laying down is PhD, right? Like being stagnant and
Yes.
laying down and not moving while the world moves around you, to me, for a dog that's having a hard time with their environment, that feels like PhD. But I see how yes, it is still like, I wouldn't say it's PhD. Like, yes, it is still more challenging, but I see how it's broken down in a more practical way of, we're not talking about like a minute or 3 minutes of, we're talking about just like a moment of breath, like a pausing, that I think, to me, speaking to you, I'm like, oh, wow, this feels way more practical and like a better way to integrate it into the practice. Because again, always felt like one more thing. And then how are we actually incorporating it into the real life scenarios, right?
Yes.
I had a few ideas, but it always felt like we had to get through some of that protocol in order to do that. But now the way in which you're speaking about it, it's actually part of the training. It's not one more thing.
It's not one more thing. And there are some of the dogs where, where we will lean on that original protocol in sort of the modified version. But my rule of thumb is, unless we're needing to get through the front door exercises on day 11 or whatever that is, like if that's something we're working on, awesome, then the protocol just takes you right through it. But otherwise, by the time we get to, air quote, day 3, day 4, if the dog is catching on to the game, cool. Then what do we actually need? Which is the piece of that that's going to be relevant for that learner with some of the examples we were talking about. And one other thing that I want to pull in here too is the idea that when we're building this level of fluency truly around relaxation, I'm not talking about an attentive working down stay. That's not what we're going for, right? It sometimes starts there, right? For a dog who's responding to the operant cue or the lure or the reward, like sometimes it starts there. But as soon as we start to get that fluency where the dog understands the physical posture, one of the things that we typically do is then start the process of disengagement. So some of what we're doing then is actually either as the handler starting to disengage from the animal and doing different things around them. So we're not just sort of staring at them, ready to mark and reward. And we also start to, when we are marking and rewarding their disengagement as well. So if I have a dog who's working and they just happen to sort of glance in the other direction, oh, that was amazing.
Yeah.
And then I might feed. And even the way in which I feed for those dogs especially, I'm typically, rather than delivering food to mouth or doing a food toss, we feed to ground.
Yep.
And we're sort of feeding to the ground, sort of, let's say if the dog is in a curved posture to the left, right, with the legs sort of out to their left side, we'll feed to what's the outside. I never know, is it the outside, is it the inside? I don't know, sort of on the opposite side of the elbow. So I'm really trying to orient that dog to the floor rather than orienting them up to me in sort of an arrow, like
a downstay, we're training mode situation.
And there's nothing wrong with training those postures, right? They have functional significance in other ways too, if that's what we're working on. But when my goal is softening muscle tension and reducing emotional arousal, and we can operationalize that. That's one of the other pushbacks that I get is, if we want to, we can measure heart rates. We can count respirations. We can measure pupil
Mhm.
dilation. We can monitor levels of piloerection or hair standing up. We can look at latency to respond to cues. We can look at what it actually means to be existing in a lower arousal state
Mhm.
versus just saying, is your dog calm?
Yeah.
What does that mean? Well, let's define it. It might look a little bit different from one dog to the next, but what I really
Yes.
want to stress is that we're not just saying this is not the downstay. This is not the working border collie, even though they really struggle with this sometimes. But it's more about that. Okay, what does it take to get a little, as you and I talk about, and I love your word for this. What does it take to get a little wiggly?
Mhm.
To not be so grippy about that particular exercise, rather to go, cool, I'm going to be here a while, not because I have to be,
Yeah.
but because I've got some fluency around this. So what's it going to look like to sit still and actually observe the world around me and take that in and process and
Mhm.
actually develop a set of coping skills that I really resonate when I hear people talking, like Grisha Stewart, for example, when she talks about the long line walks and the way that she supports dogs through her training. The way she's doing that is through a completely different set of skills. And yet I hear the same words and the same idea, in that it's not about training an operant physical position. It's about onboarding coping skills.
Mhm.
That to me is
Yes.
everything about how
Everything.
we do this. Everything.
Mhm. Yeah. And I'm thinking about that border collie, or in this case, I'm thinking about my client's dog, Sheltie, where, gosh, this dog, like, I kind of want to be this dog when I grow up, because he just, like, nothing phases him. He's so resilient. He has had really challenging moments from the dog in the home and other dogs. And he just bounces. Right. And so he was one of the 5 dogs at a recent KPA program here in Boulder, where like everyone else's dogs were just like tired, and he was still like, what are we going to do? We're training. Let's go. Right. And so he's really bouncy. He has this beautiful, beautiful heel. She's done a ton of like obedience, rally, like all that. Like, he's got that learning history of like, okay, mom's got the food and we're engaged. And I'm thinking about them in this situation. I'm wondering, like, gosh, I wonder if my client really has to change her physical position, like you're talking about, like the disengagement and the disengagement for him, right? Like, I don't know if my client can be standing facing him, right? Because there's such a
Yes.
powerful association to that position.
Yes.
And there's such a heightened arousal to that position, to be honest, that I'm going to be
Yes.
receiving information and food. And so I wonder if it would make sense for that client to really, I mean, be seated next to him, right?
Mhm.
Like, completely change what it means. Like, would you agree with that?
I totally would. Yeah.
Yeah.
I find, especially when we're working with dogs and owners, dogs and trainers, dogs and caregivers, dogs and pet parents,
Mm-hmm.
anybody who's providing that feedback within that relationship, when there's the learning history of cueing and doing,
Yes.
or offering and marking, like, again,
Yeah.
whichever way we want to go with it, when we have that relationship, when we're together, we're doing the things. It's really hard for those dogs to be.
Mm-hmm.
And I know you and I have had this conversation before in our own personal worlds as
Yeah.
well. We both tend to be doers, right? We're like, okay, and next, next,
100%.
next.
Yes.
And so it's hard. And
Mm-hmm.
for me, as well as for many of those canine learners, I have to change the environmental conditions, at least to sort of approximate that. What would it look like to go to a novel environment where I don't have reinforcement history for doing,
Mm-hmm.
and practice sitting still and meditating for 12 seconds? What would
Yeah.
it look like to not just practice yoga in my office, where I also do a lot for many hours every day, but go to the studio so I can actually practice doing it differently?
Mm-hmm.
I find the same pattern exists for my canine learners and for my
Yep.
handlers, pet parents as well, for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense. Because that is a common challenge that I hear often about the protocol, right? Because everybody is really, really fixated on relax, right? It's a
Yes.
relaxation protocol. And yes, we might not start off with like pure Zen, right? Especially given the individual dog and
Yes.
all the things that contribute to that. So I've heard a lot of pushback or have seen like, gosh, how do we do this when food is such an arousing situation for my dog, or my dog is so excited about it? But what I hear is that, well, we just have to modify these conditions,
Yes.
right?
And we can do some of the same things we do in other contexts. If food is an arousal trigger, we can lower the reinforcement value of the food. We can use, kibble or lower value items. I had one of my patients in the office years ago, and I regret that I don't have this on video either, because it was one of those just magical little moments that just worked. And it was a dog that we wanted to be able to work on relaxation. And anytime we brought food out, the dog was essentially vibrating, right? And we know those dogs. It was just like, and it just kind of lost its mind and the ability to think. So we put the food away. We're like, okay, well, I don't know what we're going to do, but we're not going there.
Yeah.
And in just sort of playing with that dog and watching the way in which it responded to the environment, it actually had the ability to lie down and to settle. And it was really responsive to not only eye contact, but also to verbal attention. So in practicing that, I essentially stood in front of the dog and asked for the sit and down, which were already in its repertoire. And then I cued the watch, and then just moved in a semicircle around it, basically using myself as the visual magnet, the same way I would normally lure that nose around to try to get that animal into that relaxed down
position.
posture.
Yeah.
And so we just pulled the dog with eye contact. And when the dog, in order to follow, shifted into the relaxed down, I just leaned in a little bit and said, "Oh my gosh, you are such a good dog." And his tail went.
Yeah.
And then, okay, let's break. And then, let's reset, let's try it again. And let's actually just practice this. And then just like any other physical cue, we were able to fade that. So rather than the full 90-degree arc, by the end of session, we're just basically saying, sit down and a little nudge, cool, settle into relax down. What a good dog you are. And we were facilitating that relaxation, utilizing reinforcers that mattered at an arousal level that was workable.
That was appropriate. Yeah.
Totally works. And then there's one other thing that popped into my head while we were talking through sort of the arousal piece. One of the other times where I get a lot of pushback from clients is when we have a dog, let's say, is the quote unquote reactive dog, but is the couch potato the rest of the time. And differentiating, again, quote unquote reactivity, having big feelings around a very defined stimulus doesn't mean the same thing as hyperactivity. I'm not saying your dog can never settle. And in fact, many of these dogs actually are highly fluent in settling and sleeping and sacking out as the world goes by. The problem, at least for many of those dogs, is that in the moment of emotional arousal, that behavioral outcome, strategy, option, choice, whatever we want to call it, is not accessible, because the arousal and the motor patterns override their ability to settle. So for those dogs, it's not about teaching them how to relax. They know how to do that.
Yes.
It's about working up a stimulus gradient that remains accessible through greater periods or greater intensities of arousal. And that's when we're able to kind of leverage the relaxation exercises. Those dogs learn the foundation step of that, like in half a session, they're nailing it, right? But it's about the influence of their specific stimuli that essentially closes the lid on their ability to remain thoughtful. And again, I think that's really the biggest piece for me is eventually, do I even need the relaxed down? For many of my patients, I don't.
Yeah.
I'm looking at, for many of them, it makes it easier to literally ground themselves and to get thoughtful and to process what's happening around them. But to some degree, for some of those dogs, it almost becomes a little bit of a crutch or an unnecessary step. If they have the ability to walk down arousal and then just shake it off, cool. Then I may not need to continue working on relaxation as long as it still remains fluent. And this is something that I can say for Cornelius over the last 18 to 20 months or so of the pandemic while I've been at home, and we just integrate a lot more of our work together as we're going about our day from the home office. I actually haven't been practicing his foundation relaxation nearly as much as I had before, and he's lost some fluency.
Mm.
And
meaning like when you ask him to relax in harder moments, you feel like because you have not done it in the house just as a maintenance.
Yes,
He's
it's
losing
less
some
accessible.
of it. Yeah.
It's less
Okay.
accessible. Yeah, exactly right. So, which the beautiful thing is, well, that's easy enough to fix.
Sure.
Go back to basics, practice even the baby steps. And it's like that little light bulb goes back on. Ah, that's right. Slow it down, take a breath.
Yes. And would you say that Cornelius is the type of dog that that actually can relax, the dogs that you were talking about in terms of like the couch potatoes? Like I would, given how many times we've been on Zoom, like he's not present or bothering anyone. Like he seems like he can relax pretty easily in the house.
He does, and he's one of those dogs. He's actually the first dog that I've owned personally. I've met them in practice, but he's one of the first dogs that I've owned that, especially when he's laying on top of you, you literally feel every ounce of tension completely evaporate from his body. Like he is just liquid. I mean, his ability to become very non-liquid in a heartbeat is also pretty profound as a bull terrier, and then he causes injuries. But his ability to let that go is, it's blissful. Like it really is amazing to see him just go completely dead weight. It's amazing. It's in there.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. And I mean, you touched on this before, but what's really important is that, this is not cueing a dog to lie down and stay, and it becomes this almost controlling type engagement with the dog and the pet parent. So this is obviously not that. And I just want you to share your perspective on like why it's not that.
Yeah, a couple of things here. It's a really important distinction, especially since so many of my clients have had at least a bit of education on kind of more traditional obedience, where they're like, oh yeah, this is the downstay exercise. Yeah. We've done that. I can hold him, at 50 paces for 7 minutes. That's fine. I was like, not the same.
Yep.
But it's important to differentiate that. So what I'll often say is, okay, well, in this exercise, our goal here is not just to be still. The goal is actually being comfortable and relaxed. Now, if your dog does those things simultaneously, then maybe this isn't something that's going to be terribly necessary. But if your dog is in that still, I can't get up, I worry about what might happen if I get up, am I going to be corrected in some way, shape, or form? That inherently maintains a bit of body or emotional tension within the learner's repertoire, right? There is some of that. And then when we think about the ways in which we learn, if we're learning through more reinforcement, appetitive, enjoyable activities, we sort of strive to do that little bit more. And it creates more, not just a sort of a quote unquote better emotion, but it actually affects the way in which learning occurs. Versus if we're learning more through avoidance of something that's unpleasant or uncomfortable, there is truly an escape aspect of that, or a level of suppression that exists. And again, I'm not trying to shame anybody in saying that, because again, there may be a time and a place where that's really relevant for a specific type of training. But for our purposes here, if my goal is relaxation, if my goal is comfort, if my goal is trust, I need to teach this particular exercise differently. And so when I'm teaching even the basic steps of the relaxation work, whether I'm luring, whether I'm capturing, whether I'm shaping, the dog is free to get up whenever they want to. This is not I've given you the down, I've given you the stay, and now you must. If the animal, no, it's really not that. If the animal gets up, either my rate of reinforcement was perhaps a little bit too slow for them to sort of maintain their engagement. Perhaps there was a distraction that was more interested, so I need to work up to that. Or perhaps there was an emotional response like fear or anxiety where I'm actually able to use that response of getting up as an indication of the barometer of their actual comfort. So for me, if the animal does get up, that's an indication. Cool. That's all we were capable of in this moment.
Yep.
And that's not a problem, right? It's just
Information.
It's information. It's data. It's just cool. No worries. If it's important to continue working on that, I can reset. We can do something else. We can come back to it. We could go right back into it if that's okay for the circumstance. But what I'm not doing, and this is such an important piece that I think comes up, whether we're talking about a downstay or a watch me protocol, my goal is not to take away the other options or the other behavioral responses for that animal. I'm not saying you now must lay here and simply tolerate what's happening around you. The goal is, can you actually be comfortable in this space? Can you absorb what's happening? Can you observe? Can you learn? If not, that's fine. We'll make it easier. We can totally do that. But it's not about must. It's not about requirement. And it's not about corrections for mistakes. We get rid of that in this particular protocol.
Yeah, I love that. I love the question, can you? Right? Like, can you anything, right? Can you do it in this circumstance? Can you recover? Can you eat? Can you listen to me? Like, can you hear what I cue?
Yes.
Like even for our human clients, right? Like, can I take a breath in this moment? Can I trust in my dog to do something different? Can I set up the environment in a way that's going to be successful for both of us? Like, it's just it feels more supportive than the you must, right? Like, there's options within it, and the can you or the can I feels, it just feels like there's more options. There's like room for brainstorming and making adjustments versus like this or this.
Yes.
Yeah. I really love that.
Absolutely. And the can you, can I, can you question here, to me, that also kind of brings me back to something that's a really fundamental piece, especially when we're talking about animals that are having big feelings, whether that's big feelings due to adolescence and impulsivity and immediate gratification and that sort of element, whether it's fear, anxiety, stress, or exuberance or frustration or whatever label we put on it. If they're having big feelings and we're getting that emotional activation, we're all sort of wired in the same way, and that with enough emotional activation, it essentially shuts down the ability to access some of those long circuits and the real thoughtful pieces of processing of information. And so what's really important for me is that if I have an animal who's being in that moment more motivated by big feelings, what they can do is less, right? In terms of really thinking about it. And at a certain level of arousal, we're actually all programmed for that emotional arousal to essentially override the thinking circuits, because our body is either responding to danger or threat, or there's something about that where access to the long circuits doesn't make sense from an evolutionary or safety standpoint. So if I'm really trying to build some of these relaxation skills, I'm really asking the question, where are you in this teeter-totter of arousal versus thoughtfulness? Are you at a point where you can actually do that? And it's not about me making that happen. I'm asking you, can you?
Can you? Yeah. I like the visual of the teeter-totter of arousal and thoughtfulness. Like, that makes a ton of sense. Like, where am I? And that's why, like, a lot of times with my clients, like, we are celebrating recovery. Like, that's all we got, right? Like, we are celebrating those moments. And I have a client the other day that actually, she sent me an email and she said that she was celebrating her recovery. And I was like, yes, because the dog had an explosive moment. Like, he had a lot of big feelings, and she was able to refocus him and move him out of that situation. But there was this really big moment where she was like, wow, I would have carried that all day. And I didn't even think to tell my partner about it. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's so amazing, right? That's like huge. Because like you said, we're operating in the same way. So that recovery is critical for us to celebrate, or else like we're all going to be like sorely disappointed.
Absolutely. Well, and what I love is what, that you mentioned sort of the visual sort of teeter-totter of that. I use that a lot with my clients because, for me, if I'm talking about sort of the emotionality and sort of who's driving the bus, who's on the up, who's on the down of the teeter-totter, if we're really responding emotionally, again, that's short-circuiting, not pathological circuiting, but just short-circuiting, where the emotion is driving the bus of what happens. And that makes the thinking part less accessible. And so if our goal is to sort of remain in that other thoughtful pattern, we either need to find a way to dissipate or mitigate that emotional arousal, either by really sort of building our cognitive skills through some of these things like we're talking about with relaxation techniques, or in other cases, it's really just allowing enough time to pass that some of those stress chemicals start to dissipate and kind of break down within the body. In other cases, we're actually facilitating that through supplements or medications or pheromones or other things to try to kind of facilitate that sort of teeter-totter, to give us a little bit more of a greater access to the toolbox that exists within the thinking part of the brain. But by thinking about that as a teeter-totter, it creates a little bit more of that space to say, where are you? We all shift back and forth between those extremes every single day. Some of us more than others, but we do it. And so, where are you? Where are you? Right?
Where?
Like
everyone in the room, raise their hand.
Raise your hand.
I love the where are you too. Like that is so. See, I tell you, this is what would Dr. Pachel say app. I mean, we have like 5 things from this episode to put in.
Just pulling them one at a time.
Literally.
Yeah,
we need to hire some sort of app developer.
I love it. I love it. Yeah, no, it really, really helps. And and bringing this back to the relaxation piece, it's like that's what allows us to do that, right?
Yeah.
All of that initial conversation about quote unquote relaxation, we're trying to find ways to build that. Oftentimes starting with a physical posture that makes it easier for the emotional arousal to dissipate or to soften, so that the brain stays online, that we're able to then focus on what is it that this animal needs to learn, or what do we think is going to be beneficial, and we've got access to the thinking part of their brain. And so it's really one of the ways when I think about how universal relaxation work really is, that's why. Is that it's not because I think the world is going to quote unquote happen in a downstay. No, not that at all. But if I have a skill set or a toolbox or a mechanical exercise that allows me to tap back into that reset button for that particular animal, I can get them back, not by forcing it, but by inviting them back to participate again and facilitating that walk down of arousal, so that we get to keep going.
Yeah, it's just somebody kindly saying, like, if I'm stressed and someone's like, hey, can you take a breath? Right? Like, cause I see your breathing right now is really short. Can you drop in and take a breath all the way down to your belly? Right. And like, gosh, it does. It just like I feel like I have access to more, and it doesn't need to be this long-winded thing. It doesn't mean that I took a 60-minute yoga class, right? It is just the moment in time for me to access that breath.
Yeah, exactly right. And then I think that comes back to sort of the arduous task of, have you done the exercises?
Totally.
Versus, can you take a breath?
Mm-hmm.
Can you pause for just a second?
Yeah.
Can you feel the shoulders rise? Can you take in that, as deep as you can go, and then just let it out, wiggle just a little.
Yeah.
And then move on.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, again, in the most stressful moment of your day, that might not be accessible to you. And that's okay.
And that's when we do like a scatter feed.
Totally. Exactly. And where's my licky mat? Like what needs to happen right now? What needs to happen? No, totally. And that's, again, probably the last piece that I would mention here is that I don't claim that the relaxation work fixes everything.
Yeah.
I had someone come up to me after a presentation. They're like, no. I can name 5 things that this won't address. And I was like, whoa, I think you heard something different than what I was trying to put out here. Let's unpack that a little bit. It's not about saying it's the panacea that everything gets better through relaxation, but I do find that I'm often better able to address that individual learner's needs, whether it's the owner's needs as the learner or whether it's the animal's needs, by creating those moments of pause and intention and collaboration and breath and space. everything gets a bit easier when we have the capacity to do that. And that's why it's so universal to me, not because it fixes, but because it facilitates.
Love it. So you have a course on Dog iBox on how to teach this. So
I do.
Where we're going to put all the information that we talked about today, the protocols and links to your sites and the course, but where can listeners find that?
Yeah. So not only that particular link that you, as you said, you're going to share, but all of the webinars, the podcasts like this one, including some of the other ones that you and I have recorded together, those are all on the website, drpachel.com. So DRPACHEL, drpachel.com. And feel free to dig in through there, but especially the media page. That's where you're going to find the podcasts, the articles, the videos, a variety of options there on a whole bunch of different topics. That's where you're going to find them.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here and talking about this topic. I'm so happy we were talking about our relationship as behavior consultants to specific exercises. And I'm so excited. I'm more inspired by this now and can see how I can weave it in better than what I have before. So I hope that that's helpful for clients listening, for behavior and training consultants that are listening. So thank you for being here. Appreciate your brilliant mind.
You are certainly welcome. It's a pleasure to be here as always, and my best to everyone who's listening. Onward and upward.
Thanks so much.